Good morning. And I guess this is not the faint of heart. These are really important issues, and they're also complex. And I think you play a particularly important role in how we deal with these issues. And so I want to encourage you. And you've already heard about having uncomfortable conversations. I sometimes work with organizers and unions, and they believe that you actually, where most things happen, comes out of productive tension, not a quiescent. So when you're completely comfortable, it's like exercise, right? It's like you don't get that burn, you're probably not pushing yourself quite far enough. On the other hand, you don't want to injure yourself. So it's like we want to give you a little burn, but we don't want to injure you. I think of race in some ways, and certainly, and I'll talk more about this, in racism, a little bit like gravity. Bet you that surprised you, right? So according to most scientists, even though all of us have weight, and most of us know approximately what our weight is, only about 12 people in the world really understand gravity. That surprised most people because most of us think, oh, I know what gravity is, right? It's what keeps me on the planet. It's not quite that simple. So when you look at it more carefully, gravity is an incredibly complicated process. Now, I'm not one of those 12 people, so I'm done with gravity. And I think of race and racism as like gravity. So all of us have a race. All of us have opinions about it. But when you peel it back, it's incredibly complicated. And the complexity of it is important, not so that we'll, become a college course, or not, because it informs so much of what happens in society out there, but also so much of what happens inside of us. And yet, because we have this apparent familiarity with it, we don't spend time thinking about its complexity. In fact, I would say in our society, in many ways, because we've learned in some ways that racism is a bad thing, we spend much of our time running away from it, avoiding it. Can't we get beyond it? And instead of really spending the time to understand it. So what I'm going to do today is sort of try to, in some ways, deepen both the complex understanding of race and how it operates, but also make it a little bit more familiar. So I'm going to try to do both. And this is by Douglas McAdams. You don't need to read all this, I'll give you this. Basically, he's a social scientist, and he basically looks at the country becoming divided. And by most accounts, the country is more divided, both politically and economically, almost any time, more than any time over the last 100 years. Politically, by some accounts, we're more divided than we were since the Civil War. Now that's interesting, and we're divided racially. In a time that many people thought that with an African American in the White House, we were almost, as the article that was written recently by your host, that we were almost in a post-racial society. And I literally remember giving a talk at the Democratic Convention, basically saying, if Senator Obama becomes President Obama, unless we're careful, we'll usher in a new era of racial anxiety. And people thought I was crazy. It's like, no, we won't. I mean, if he gets elected, we're done, right? Well, maybe not. But there's a lot of things that indicate that we're not done. And part of it was the way that we understand race. Another thing that's interesting about race, and we, in this country, we sort of argue oftentimes, is it race or is it class? And there was a debate I was having with a professor from Harvard. He was saying, you know what? Race, and certainly racism, is an inexact term. We don't really know what it means. And people throw it around. We should stop using it and start using class instead. And I said, I'm happy to go there if you can tell me what class means. And it turns out, I would say, maybe the only term that we understand less well than race in our society is class. We don't have a clue what class means, right? We're in a society where 95% of the people call themselves middle class. That's a big middle class. People making $20,000 a year, people making $2 million a year, both call themselves middle class. And for those of you who take class a little more seriously, there's no class consciousness. We don't have a labor party. We don't have a middle class strike. We don't have class solidarity. So what do we mean by class? And usually we mean something, not race. That's right. Okay, that's it. And I've written in a long paper trying to understand the relationship between race and class in the United States, and also understand how our concept of class in the United States was deeply informed by race and by slavery. And so this effort to sort of neatly pull them apart is one might call a fool's errand. I don't want to call him a fool, but it actually is sometimes obfuscating something to get away from race. And not saying you can reduce everything to race, but saying there's this complicated interaction between race and class in the United States. And when we look at it, we begin to see it. And part of the way that race is complicated, and this is Alicina, a book called Fighting Poverty in the United States and Europe, A World of Difference. They try to understand why the social system in the United States and Europe is so different. And what they're economists, so they have to use fancy economic terms like econometrics. They use some econometrics, which is basically trying to isolate causation. And they say 75% of the difference is explained in terms of our racial history. And they're not talking about what black people get, what even white people get. They're talking about the structure of our society. They're talking about the design of our society. So part of the complexity is some people will say, so nothing's changed. Well, that can't be true. That simply can't be true. If I were talking to you in the 1960s or 70s, I wouldn't be talking to you, right? You wouldn't have a black man standing up here talking in this august place, and many of the people in the room wouldn't be here. There'd probably be fewer women, and there certainly would be fewer people of color. So something has changed. And at the same time, things have gotten better and things have gotten worse. And our ability to make sense of it is actually inadequate, right? We have a language that's, well, is so-and-so racist? It's like, well, maybe, maybe not. But can we say that racialized outcomes have significantly changed? I'm working with a number of programs across the country. We have something called Government Alliance for Racial Equity. We're working with thousands of elected officials to help them understand and deal with racial equity. One of those places is Minneapolis. The mayor of Minneapolis is a personal friend of mine, Betsy Hodges. I endorsed her. I sent her money. She's white. She's a good person. I would say, in many ways, not to draw comparisons, I know President Obama before he was president, but I would say on these issues, she's as good as President Obama, if not better. Despite that, segregation in schools in Minneapolis, partially under her watch, but partially before, has gone up 1,000%. So how is it that you have this good, caring, progressive person in Minneapolis and segregation with all the negative incidents of that, and I know David Williams came and talked to many of you, has actually increased? We would think that if we get a person who really cares, who's racially sensitive, things would necessarily get better. But they've gotten substantially worse. And we talked about police killings. We just had a situation in Minneapolis where a young black man was killed. So how do you make sense of that under the watch of a progressive, caring mayor? One of the ways that I talk about these issues is marginalization, structural marginalization, which some people, myself included, might call structural racism. But let me just spend a second on that. In the 1990s, structural racism wasn't part of the lexicon. That's not the way we understood racism. We understood it as Wallace saying segregation forever. We understood it as Jim Crow. We understood it as the Ku Klux Klan. And clearly, we had made some progress beyond that. Not that those had completely gone away, but there was a consensus in the country that those things were bad. And yet, people of color, particularly blacks and Latinos, Native Americans, weren't necessarily doing so well. So how did you make sense of that? So we started talking about structural racism, bringing that into the lexicon. We talked about how do you push that out so people begin to understand that race and racism is not just about interpersonal relationships. And we worked on that for almost 2 years, debating, arguing, writing, changing. And just as we were about to go public with this effort, I had an epiphany that it shouldn't be called structural racism. It should be called structural racialization. And the reason I suggested that is that we have already an understanding of racism. That racism was too closely tied to personal animus. And that structural racialization, in terms of how people get organized through structures, is not dependent upon personal animus. And that structural marginalization is something that happens not just with blacks, but with women, with people with disabilities, people who are sometimes immigrants, that we use structures to actually marginalize people. And that if we're going to really interrupt and create the kind of fair and inclusive society that I think all of you want, we can't just look at personal behavior. We have to look at the work the structures are doing. So if I was talking about this session today, I would use the word structural racialization, but I wouldn't stop there. That's actually helping to understand the mechanisms that actually marginalize people. But you don't want to just understand how people are marginalized along racial axis. You actually want to interrupt that. You want to change that. I can tell you're practical people. So what's the answer? Well, these are complicated things. But there's a simple way of understanding it that I want to put out to you. That is, we're talking about not just removing those things that discriminate in society through structures. Think about Ferguson. What was going on in Ferguson? We actually have a suburb that's basically broke. We have a tax system that doesn't allow for the adequate raising of revenue. So Ferguson comes up with a system for revenue by giving people tickets. By basically saying, if you have blinds in your front windows that don't match, they can give you a ticket. That's not just true in Ferguson. That's true throughout 4 communities all over the country. And a report out of Missouri suggested that even where the elected officials are majority black, you still have that system in place. You have a structure in place that will disproportionately injure, alienate, marginalize low-income people of color. So you don't just fix that by, we already talked about it, diversity is important, but by bringing a black in, if you don't change the structure, you don't change it. So what's the solution to structural discrimination, structural racialization, structural racism, structural marginalization? What's the solution to that? The solution is quite simple. Structural inclusion. How do we organize structures so they do the work we want to do? How do we affirmatively, we're not just sort of saying, let's remove those things that are keeping people out. That's a good start. But I want to go further and say, how do we actually affirmatively create structures that bring people in?